Greetings, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with an instructional video on how to compose your final paper. By this point in your research, you've got a topic, you've formulated a research question, and you've also annotated all of your sources. Now, in this last part of the project, you're going to put all of these things together. You're going to take all of your sources and use them to produce a coherent historical narrative that both answers your research question and makes an original contribution to scholarly knowledge on your topic. How can you do this? What exactly are you supposed to do with all of your sources, and how might you organize your final paper? The goal of this video is to answer those questions and to clarify exactly what I'm looking for in this assignment. First and foremost, let me state the obvious. Your essay should be argumentative. More specifically, it should be organized around a central thesis, a thesis that you'll support with evidence derived from your primary sources. And when I say primary sources, I mean primary sources. I cannot underscore this enough. The data you use to illustrate your thesis should come from your primary sources. If the proof of your argument comes largely from the work of other scholars, then that's a sign that your research isn't very original, and it isn't going to do much to go beyond the existing scholarship. So as to avoid this, make sure that you're getting as much argumentative information out of your primary sources as possible. So, when writing your final paper, be sure to do two things. First, be direct about what it is you're trying to prove, and second, back up your main claim by way of reference to detailed historical examples from your primary sources. When I grade your paper, the score I give it will largely be determined by how persuaded I am by the argument you're making. So, as you write this, keep the following questions in the forefront of your mind. 1. Does my thesis actually answer my research question? 2. Does the data I'm presenting align with my thesis? And third, does this data actually support the point I'm trying to prove? If the answer to any of these questions is no, that's a sign that something in your research needs to be adjusted. So as you go about assembling your argument, keep asking yourself, is the evidence in favor of my argument thin? Am I speculating or otherwise making unfounded, unsubstantiated points? Is the documentary support for the things I'm trying to convince the reader of lacking? Along these lines, you might be wondering, what constitutes substantive evidence? What's the difference between evidence that's thin and evidence that's thick? In answering this question, let me first pass on the advice I received from my graduate school advisor. Beat me over the head with an avalanche of evidence. Submit such a heavy volume of this that at some point the reader just says, "Okay, I give up. I can't find any holes in your argument. You win." If that's the reaction you get from the reader, chances are that you've done your job adequately. Another thing that will help here is thinking about your audience. For this paper, you should assume that you're writing for a general audience. Maybe someone who knows a little bit about the history of sexuality, but who has nowhere near the amount of expertise that you've acquired in the course of the semester. Because your reader is not a specialist in your particular subfield, when you're presenting your evidence, you need to do so in a way that connects all of the dots. So, for example, when presenting a quote or some other kind of hard data in support of your thesis, don't just let the evidence make the case for you. Don't assume that the reader can figure things out on themselves. Instead, analyze the data you're presenting and then explain exactly how it supports your argument. You can think about this the way that you've written your quizzes for this class. In the quizzes, I ask you to get into the details of an author's argument, presenting specific historical examples from readings so as to help show me that you know what you're talking about. The same standard applies here. So again, be detailed, connect all the dots, and be blunt about how the evidence you're presenting supports the assertion you're making. Because the audience you're writing for here is a general one, a final good strategy is to have a friend or classmate read your writing. Sometimes we're so deep into our own research that we don't realize when we're not making sense or when something is amiss with our arguments. So as to get some perspective on things, I'd recommend you share a draft of your paper with someone who is not familiar with your topic. Ask them to spot any flaws or weaknesses in your argument and see if they have any suggestions for how you can strengthen the persuasive power of your thesis. Often, it's readers with no prior knowledge of our topic that give us some of the best feedback, so I'd really encourage you to seek this out. Okay, so if the bulk of the data you'll use to support the paper's main claim is going to come from the primary sources, then you might be asking yourself, what do I do with the secondary sources? That's the next thing we need to address. And in getting into this, let me first say that the argument you develop in your paper is going to be multi-tiered. Specifically, it will simultaneously operate on two levels, one historical, the other historiographical. The historical part of your argument is the one that I already talked about, that is, your answer to your research question. The historiographical part is the part where you explain the relevance of your study with regard to ongoing scholarly conversations on your topic. This is where you relate your work to what other historians are doing, and where you defend the importance of your research by pointing out how it builds off of and pushes these conversations forward. In many ways, what you are doing here is addressing the dreaded "so what" question. Let's say you've convinced me that your thesis is valid. So what? What does it matter? Even if your thesis makes sense, that doesn't automatically mean I should care about it. In terms of making me and other people care about it, you need to answer the "so what" question. This is where you use your research to fill certain gaps in the existing scholarship. It's where you explain what makes your study an original contribution to knowledge on your topic. Now, there are a variety of ways you can go about answering this "so what" question. In terms of explaining the broader scholarly significance of your study, focus on what is new and what is different about your research. Maybe the new thing that you're bringing to the table is your argument itself. If your interpretation of the data in your primary sources contrasts with those of other scholars, then you could underscore the significance of your findings by noting this contrast. Registering disagreement with the work of other historians in other ways is one way to contribute to existing scholarly discussions. And if you notice that historians are largely split in their interpretations, then you could position your research as an attempt to resolve this scholarly impasse by determining which historians are right and which historians are wrong. Even if your findings themselves are not relatively novel, there are still lots of other ways of pushing the research on your topic forward. For example, perhaps you're bringing new sources into the conversation, sources that other scholars really haven't taken into consideration when addressing your question. Even if your argument is similar to those made by other historians, if you're making use of an untapped set of historical records, then you're providing more evidence for that argument and enriching our understanding of the topic. Or, alternatively, perhaps you're covering a period of time that hasn't been highlighted yet. If scholars have addressed your question by looking at a later era or an earlier historical era, then the gap that you're filling would be a chronological one. Or perhaps your gap is geographical. If existing studies on your general topic have focused mostly on other parts of the world, then you can demonstrate the originality of your own work by calling attention to the fact that no one has said very much about the country or region that you're focusing on. All of these are just a few of the potential ways that you can ensure your argument is not only historical, but also historiographical. Of course, you'll have to figure out the best way to position your work as something that builds on earlier studies. As you think about this, keep asking yourself, what's the significance of my argument in terms of the scholarship on my topic? How does my thesis engage the writing of other historians who have studied this? Am I positioning my argument as something that goes beyond what earlier studies did? As all of the above suggests, part of what you'll be doing in your final paper is reviewing and critiquing the existing scholarship on your topic. If the historical argument you're making is going to derive from the primary sources, then the historiographical argument should come from the secondary sources. You don't need to go through your sources one by one, as this would be tedious and counterproductive. Instead, you want to look at the existing scholarship holistically, grouping articles and books together in a way that highlights the gaps you've identified in them. Proceeding in this fashion will allow you to cut a quick path through the literature, one that allows the reader to see what's wrong, what's missing, what still needs to be done, and most importantly, how you're going to do those things in your own work. So please don't review each secondary source separately. Draw out the common tendencies, themes, assumptions, arguments, etc., in a way that allows you to talk about multiple pieces of scholarship in a single paragraph. So this is one way you'll bring secondary sources into your discussion, by critiquing them and explaining how your own research fills some of the gaps in the scholarship. But this isn't the only way you can use your secondary sources. Another thing that they're valuable for is context. If the focus of your paper is a person, a group of people, an event, or some larger historical development, you can use your secondary sources to familiarize the reader with these things. You can use them for background information, for setting up your argument, for storytelling purposes. Even if you're disagreeing with some other historian's argument, my guess is that there's some valuable information in their book or article that's important for understanding your own argument. So feel free to use secondary sources in this manner, to fill in some of the missing pieces in your own historical narrative, so that the reader gets a coherent picture of the thing that you're writing about. Okay, now lastly, I want to talk about a few organizational matters. If you look at the syllabus, you'll see that I've specified that your final paper should contain at least 3 sections: an introduction, a literature review, and a section where you analyze your primary sources. The first of these is an absolute must. In the opening section of the paper, you should briefly introduce your topic and then move on to detailing your research question. Once you've done this, your introductory section should conclude with your thesis statement, which needs to be both historical and historiographical. And from here, I'd like you to preview the main points you're going to develop in the body of the essay to prove your point. Another thing you'll need to do in your paper is have a conclusion. This should obviously come at the very end, and it should just recap all of the main points of the paper. Don't say anything new here. In between the introduction and the conclusion, there can be more flexibility. In the syllabus, I specify that you should have a literature review and a primary source analysis section. That's fine. If you want to organize your paper in this manner, you can, but you can also propose alternative sectional headings. If this structure doesn't work for you, feel free to deviate from it. As you've seen from the many articles we've read over the course of the semester, most historians don't put formal literature reviews into their writings. Instead, they spread the historiographical content of their essays out, so that parts of it appear here, other parts there, etc. So what I'd recommend is that you use some of the articles we've read this semester as a template. If there's one particular piece you've enjoyed, read through it again and look at how the author organized it. Chances are, at least part of the reason you liked it was because it had what you thought was a good flow from one section to the next. And if this is the case, then you can consider replicating the layout of this paper. It's perfectly acceptable to use the writings of our favorite scholars as models for our own writing. And doing this will have the added benefit of making you more aware of the mechanics of scholarly writing. So think about this as an option when you structure your paper.